We're going to talk about this because the think tank Annabelle works for the Free Market Institute for Economic Affairs has published some new research looking at the political attitudes of young people. They polled just under 2,000 people aged between 16 and 34 in the UK earlier this year, asking them about their attitudes to capitalism. Let's show you this statistic first. 67% of 16 to 34-year-olds say they would like to live in a socialist economic system. Roll on to 75% of 16 to 34-year-olds agree with the statement that socialism is a good idea, but it has failed in the past because it has been badly done. I think that will come up in just a moment. Annabelle, your think tank argues that this is a wake-up call for supporters of the market economy. But haven't young people always been more skewed and more left-wing?
Yes, they have. I mean, I suspect that this report is music to Ash's ears, and there are a few main takeaways. The first is that this millennial socialism is not a passing fad that ended when Jeremy Corbyn stood down as leader of the Labour Party. The second point, and to your question, Joe, is that young people are not growing out of socialism as they have historically done. In fact, if anything, the data suggests that they're growing into it. And that means that supporters of the market economy can no longer bury their heads in the sand. They can no longer shrug their shoulders and just assume that it's a phase that people will grow out of, nor is it to be assumed as an abstract aspiration, because that's what people said about Brexit, and look where we are now. And a final point, I would just say that this polling was trying to establish what young people currently believe. It wasn't suggesting what we believe that they should think. And actually, if we're arguing against anybody in this report, it's those on our own side who have become quite complacent about the anti-capitalist backlash that we're seeing among the young. They're choosing to just dismiss it or even deny it when it's quite obviously happening.
Right. Well, before I get Ash's response, Tom, do you still believe in capitalism, or has your generation become a bit complacent?
Well, I'm 32-year-old, so I'm right at the upper limit of that. So we'll see whether I think if you said to me, in principle, would you like to live in a perfectly operating socialist society? Well, actually, the principles of socialism, I think it all sounds a bit nice and rosy. But actually, if you look at the lives that young people lead today, the things they buy, the things they enjoy, they very much live in capitalist lifestyles. So I think it's probably explaining some of those realities. But I do think, obviously, in the school system, we need to explain the absolute destruction that socialist economies have wreaked throughout history. And I think looking at this idea that, it's just been managed in the wrong way, it was always managed in the wrong way. Give me an example of a successful socialist country. There isn't one.
Ash,
there's a reason for that.
Right, well, Ash, that question is for you. Is it because young people here haven't really ever experienced what it might be like to live under a proper socialist government?
Well, I think what young people have is an experience of living in a capitalist economy which is failing them. And there's one thing which I'd like to disagree with that was said earlier, which is, well, haven't young people always been more left-wing? That's simply not the case. People always forget that Margaret Thatcher won a majority of young voters. We're talking 18 to 24-year-olds, that exact cohort, which we all like to think of as, living the life of the young ones, left-wing firebrands. That wasn't the case in the 1980s. But what has happened since then, I think, is less to do with shifts of values, but actually a shift in how the economy works and the fact that has systematically disadvantaged young people. So in some parts of London, the average house price is 20 times the average wage. And we've seen the single biggest squeeze on living standards since the Napoleonic Wars following the financial crisis. And young people have been the biggest losers in all of that. So you've got an economy where fundamentally people like me are locked out of asset inflation. So we are looking at incredibly vulnerable, incredibly precarious futures. You add on to that the climate crisis, that we look at the fact that the government is not set to meet its own legally binding targets of achieving net zero by 2050. You look at this sense of, you can buy anything you want. You've got all this consumer power, and yet you can't get the things that you really need to live a dignified and secure life. No wonder young people are turning away from capitalism. It's failing them.
And a good example where people should look to a socialist government?
Well, I think we can look at all kinds of socialised public service provision and go, that has succeeded. I'm with you in a critique of authoritarian socialism. I'm a Democrat. I like political freedoms. But where you look at where public services have been delivered in a way which is fair and high quality, those have been collectively owned and managed.
The SNP, I mean, isn't a socialist party, is it a capitalist party?
We're a social democratic party, and I think the important thing from this report, Joe, is to recognise that young people are not just one homogenous group. You know, it's quite a big age range. I've read the report. It goes from age 16 through to 34. But what is not a surprise to me is this idea that people are shunning the kind of failed Tory economic model. That's something that we see in Scotland. That's why, for example, the Conservatives have never won an election in Scotland since the 1950s. But don't be surprised when young people want to see investment in social housing. They want to see good employment policies coming forward. For example, taking action on exploitative zero-hours contracts. All these things the UK government have failed to do. And that's why it's no surprise that young people in Scotland want to make sure that we can have that future, that Scotland gets to choose its own future in a post-pandemic referendum, so that people in Scotland can make their own decisions, not Boris Johnson.
Tom?
I think there is a legitimate point here, and I think there is a housing crisis that we're living with at the moment, and I do think we need to build more houses and we need a more participatory economic system. So and I can see why there is a problem with young people today.
Right. I mean, do you think the Conservative government, successive governments, have done enough to help young people across the board?
I think there's been lots of positive steps, but I think when it comes to the housing market, there is a problem, a big problem. You know, and I think we need to have if you want to have capitalism, you have to have capitalists, and that means owning assets. And if we don't have a large proportion of young people owning or even aspiring realistically to own their own home, we have a big problem. So, like, I do have some.
So why therefore discriminate young people when it comes to paying people who are under the age of 25 a different wage from the people that are doing the exact same job as them on the factory floor or elsewhere in the workplace? You know, if the Conservatives are serious about making sure that we have equality for young people, why do we pay people who are under 25 a different level of pay?
Tom?
Well, I don't really think they should be, but I would say, though, that we need to listen to young people who do feel alienated from the economic system. I'm not saying, you know, I am a capitalist, but I'm sort of participatory. We need a participatory economic system, you know, and I think some of the behaviour of global corporate entities, I think we can be firmer on that. You know, so you're not going to have me, you know, that's not the kind of capitalist that I am. I'm a sort of participatory economic.
But in an issue, for example, where the government can legislate for pay equality, that's not, you know, big capital or big corporate organisations. This is the government's baked into its own pay system is pay inequality. Why is the United Kingdom government, led by Boris Johnson, not doing more to protect young people and give them a brighter future?
I think there's lots of great things the government are doing at the moment to support young people, encouraging firms to take on young apprentices. I think, you know, there's many examples of government investing in young people, but actually these planning reforms the government bring forward, they have been much criticised and derided. But actually, I think we do need to think about how we're going to give young people a stake in the future. And for me, that does involve owning your own home.
Annabelle, listening to Tom talk about the sort of capitalist he is, do you think the Tory party is still a capitalist party?
I mean, I certainly think it's moving away from that. The problem that we've got at the moment is there's a political realignment underway. It's been underway since 2010, and the key swing voters now are traditional Labour supporters who are anti-market, but even more anti-woke, and that's why they're moving towards the Conservative Party. But as we emerge from this crisis, I think that, you know, it's very important that we swing over to window back to the right, and that this Conservative government does pursue free market economics. You know, there's a lot to unpack with what the panellists have said in the past couple of minutes. To Tom's point on housing, yes, 78% of young people blame capitalism for Britain's housing crisis, which is ludicrous. It's government intervention and its failure to liberalise planning that is to blame for our housing crisis. And if we could just move to a situation like you have in most OECD countries, you know, bring down housing costs to the OECD average, then that would make a big difference to young people and their quality of life.
All right.
And if I may, just to Ash's point on, you know, I want democracy. You know, democratization doesn't make countries richer. If you look at South Korea, Taiwan, Chile, they weren't democracies when their economic liftoff began.
Okay. Let me let Ash in. You've only got 20 seconds, Ash. Respond.
Look, what I'm going to say is that I love that, you know, the IEA loves to talk about government regulation has created the housing crisis. It's not. It's marketisation. We used to have ample council housing in this country, cheap, affordable housing for people. Now, 4 in 10 of those are buy-to-lets. That's the crisis.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Ash. That's all we've got time for. From all of us here, bye-bye.